You know, Pedro and I have never met before this week. Shared some breakfast and some good conversation since we've met. And been struck, I think, by so many links from totally different experiences and totally different directions, how many links there are in the conversations that we've been having in different places and that we're now having with you. So what we thought would be really good for us to hear would be to hear, what are you asking? What are your questions? What is in your hearts as this conference draws to a close and as you try to make sense of the narrative of the conference in the light of the narrative of your lives and your work. And so, you know, without promise of answers, we just like to sit with your questions and join with you in trying to make some sense if we can. So we just have some free time. We've got 20 minutes just to actually hear, where are you? What are you thinking? And what might we be able to make some sort of a contribution to? So any questions from the floor? Now, there better be some, otherwise. Yes.
Question probably to you, Pedro. Paolo, slash pastor, my wonderful Florence Ferreira. Critical pedagogy. How does that inform your?
So the question was about critical pedagogy, and Paulo Freire is, and for you, Pedro, yeah?
So Paulo Freire has had enormous influence on my thinking over many years, and I had the good fortune of actually studying with him on a number of occasions. And I think the part that I would bring from Freire most to this conversation is the way he thinks of what he calls a limit situation. Right? And he talks about the fact that in any situation of oppression, there are constraints, but there are also possibilities, which is what I was speaking to a moment ago. And the job of education is to critically read the situation to identify both the constraints and the possibilities. And so that's that's one part that I draw upon. What I find, I think, particularly most inspiring about Freire's work is its deeply humanizing ethos, right? Because what Freire recognizes is the capacity that all human beings have to be agents of change in their own lives, in small and large ways. Just to give you one example, I heard Jane Goodall. Everybody know about Jane Goodall? She's just an extraordinary person, but who I think embodies agency. But the other person I often think about who embodies agency is Harriet Tubman. I'm not sure how many of you know. Harriet Tubman was a slave in the United States who literally freed more people from slavery than anyone else prior to the end of the Civil War. And she did it by playing on the assumptions of others, because she was a woman who was a slave and who was disabled, who was believed to basically be an invisible non-entity. And that allowed her to go amongst enemy lines and to literally free people on this Underground Railroad. And when she was approaching the end of her life, they asked her, how do you manage to free so many people? She said, I could have freed thousands more had they not been afraid. And again, you look at her and say, this one person? One person.
Thank you. You can only be the hero of your own life. We can learn from other people, but you have to step into your own life. You can only be the hero of your own life. And as Pedro says, a lot of my work is in that whole notion of agency. What other questions are there, guys?
I'm just thinking, both of you have worked with so many principles. What do you see as the commonality between highly successful principles and those principles that are in crisis?
So the question was, we've worked with so many principles in all sorts of different places and countries. What do we see as commonalities between highly successful principles and the second part was? And crisis and what's happening, in some parts of what I said was sort of trying to get at that. But, highly successful principles are people of hope still, for me. They still believe it can be better in the future than it is at the present. That's one of the things that stands out for me, and not just in principles but in leaders. So I see that. They have, in many ways, a blend of intelligences that I find really compelling. They've got technical intelligence for sure. But they've got personal intelligence, self-awareness, they've got interpersonal intelligence, sense of the other, and they've got narrative intelligence. And so if you can imagine those on 4 quadrants, 4 segments in a circle, and around that, they do their work with the contextual intelligence. And so to me, I see those 5 things in various forms in highly successful principles. And sometimes I see 1 or 2 missing in people who are in crisis. Principles change the world. Principles change schools. Principles change the world. You don't always see the end of your influence. You're like a ripple, like a pebble in a lake. But it goes somewhere. And you've said it this morning, Pedro, it goes somewhere. You can't see the end of your work, but it does go somewhere. And I've made differences as a principal that I didn't realize I'd made. Sometimes I find out things that I thought, wow, that was nothing to me and a lot to you. So, your work is so influential.
Big what?
Juggernaut.
Uh-huh.
Because over the last 10 years, I think in Australian education, we've been heading in this direction. That's quite a different direction for those of us who, can you hear this? Yep. Who might have been in a previous place. So to turn this juggernaut around, we've had, probably a lot of us here, a few years of us thinking about this stuff. But our teachers have not had that same opportunity because we've been sort of sorting this out and getting ahead of it, speaking for myself, but I think other colleagues have said the same thing. So if we've now reached that point where we know the juggernaut needs to be turned around, are there some simple, maybe 1 or 2 steps that we should do first to start to turn the juggernaut around?
Well, the first thing to do is to recognize the madness. And that's a huge, you already recognize the madness. I'm not sure everybody heard the question. We know this is the case. We see this juggernaut. It's not the same, not just in schools. It's a juggernaut in lots of ways. Bob Brown talked about environmental juggernaut. Pedro's talked about social divide, social juggernaut. We see the refugee juggernaut. We see this coming up everywhere. Are there simple steps that we can take? Firstly, we have to recognize that. I'm not sure that this is right, but for me, what I feel I have to do is I have to stand up in my circle of influence and start. If I try to get this right, if I try to figure this out, I'll spend a lot of time in a beautiful place back here making great sense of things. I really feel that I have to, the word journey, in French, it's the word for day. And we think journey and we think we have to change that because it's out there and it disheartens us because it's huge. It is a juggernaut. But to me, if your life can be a necklace of well-lived days, if your leadership can be a necklace of well-lived days, because the word journey came from how far can you go in a day when you walk? It was the original sense of it. And to me, I sometimes think we dishearten ourselves by looking at the summit and looking at the depths of things, and we don't look at the next step that we can take that turn things round in our circle of influence. Now, it may seem small and it may be too modest, and maybe the world needs a bigger paintbrush or a bigger canvas that we're working on. But I'm not Mandela. I'm not Pope Francis. You know what Pope Francis's motto is? I am flawed, but I'm a good and gifted person, and I'm called to offer my gifts. That's enough. I'm flawed, but I'm a good and gifted person, and I'm called to offer my gifts. If we could walk into our days flawed, but good and gifted people, and come and offer what we can offer, work from where we are. I think, at least we're throwing a starfish back in. We're not going to clear the beach, but we're starting to throw some starfish back in, and maybe together leadership could be a movement for good in the world, and maybe when we start to connect up and collaborate, all those things start to make a bigger difference. I believe it's a shift in source, a paradigm shift, exactly as what Pedro has said this morning.
I would add, I think incremental change is change. We have to move away from thinking that unless there's total change, there's no change.
Yeah.
And you can start with your school. But now I think the challenge is, because I think you're right, you've been here, your teachers aren't here. How do you get them on board to understand the nature of the work that we're trying to do, to empower them, right? So in the ways you've been empowered, so that they in turn can empower their children, the students, and the families you work with. And I think that if you are clear that that's what the work is, and that you don't have to ask for permission to do it. Right? Because that's what I think results in the paralysis, this sense, well, we can come up with so many reasons why we can't do it, and then we overlook all the things we can do. I would focus on those things.
Anything else? Yes. Steve.
Sort of a pragmatic question. I'm thinking about, I wholeheartedly agree about changing the culture within our society and how we play such a critical role in circumventing the passions within communities and within families. I'm certainly it. But one of the complexities that I have, I might say, I have is in a small school. I don't have the resourcing to be able to support particularly challenging and difficult behaviours. So I've got a class, my other two teachers have got classes, I've got a child that definitely needs a lot of support to try and change the patterns within his family environment that's been going on. Now, the question that I've had so many times is, how much do I sacrifice to the other students in the school for this one child? How much do I tolerate? So, for example, I need to leave my classroom and leave the responsibility of a teacher aide there learning pretty much stopped while I go and circumvent and manage this other child who's throwing things around and needs to be excluded from the classroom. How much do I continue in supporting that particular child rather than suspending the child? And I'm sorry to be so pragmatic. I'd just like to have your thoughts on that.
So I'll give it a try, and then you can jump in, Brendan. I mentioned before I have 5 children of my own. Right? And I would say I want to challenge something Brendan said about, I think as a parent, you're only as happy as your saddest child. If you've got a child in trouble, it eats at you. Right? Now, as a parent, I made a decision, because I lost my first wife, that I was not going to allow myself to lose any of my children. Right? And so when I had a son who was in trouble, I had to drop everything to give him the attention he needed, because I couldn't let him slip through the cracks. Now, in doing so, I had to, in some way, neglect some of my other children, because he needed my time and attention. Now, I did have to try to balance. I still had to make sure that they had a place to live and, and they were being fed, but I had to give him more. Now, obviously, when you expand the numbers, it gets harder, right? Because you're now not talking about 5, you're talking about, I don't know, how many you have, 150, 200, 300. But I would still say that we have to think of it that way, because as soon as we lapse into thinking, well, we can write off some, this one is too troubled, we go down a path where we're always going to lose those who need us the most. Now, at the same time, like you, I'm a pragmatist. And we've got to be smart and strategic in how we approach it. And that's where getting help in this work becomes so important. In your community, among the parents, I think we have to be resourceful in how we think about approaching it. But I really want to encourage you not to do the triage work, right? The triage work that we would do is say, you know what, this one is just too much trouble. I'm just going to have to let you go because I have to think about these. And I see that happen a lot in schools. And the numbers that we write off just continue to grow.
We need to close off. I can't add much to that. I never resolved that. I never resolved that as a principal. What I got better at was forgiving myself sometimes if I felt I'd done what I could. Because sometimes I carried that too long and felt that I had missed, that I'd chosen the wrong vocation because I hadn't been able to turn something around that I felt deeply about and change the life maybe when it needed me most. I think it was Gandhi said that the mark of a civilization is what it does for its weakest. I think the mark of a school could be that as well at times. What do we do for our weakest, even though it can cause us some dark nights of the soul as a leader? Look, we need to close off, guys. Your morning tea is waiting for you, and that was short and hopefully reasonably sweet. Just on my behalf, a great joy and a great pleasure to be with you. I've met so many of you this week, and I've met so many, people that I admire and people that I've enjoyed being with. So look, take care of yourselves, and hopefully our paths will cross again. So.
Thank you.